All right, I thought I'd do a little State of the Union address for what's happening with religion in America politically. Hi, I'm Brit Hartley. I have a master's degree in theology with a focus on the future of American religion. So I want to start with one of the most important shifts in American religious life, that political identity is now a stronger predictor of religious affiliation than the other way around. So in other words, it used to be that religion determined your politics, or at least helped to determine your politics, and now politics is the thing that's determining your religion. It's politics that's the bigger deciding factor. And according to a 2021 paper in the Sociology of Religion, nearly 40% of people who disaffiliated from religion cited political differences with their congregation as the key reason. And the majority of that are going to be white millennials, white Gen Z, liberals who see Christianity as synonymous with Republican values and so are leaving church because they just don't feel like they have a home there. And there's lots of studies that support this. Michelle Margolis, she was at Harvard. Now I think she's at UPenn. She wrote this groundbreaking book in 2018 called From Politics to the Pews. And she's talking about how liberals are disaffiliating from churches because they see Christianity as politically conservative, and conservatives are remaining Christian or coming back to Christianity as a way to reinforce their political identity. So partisanship is shaping your religion, not the other way around. And there used to be, even in my memory when I was younger, different kinds of political stances within one congregation. Like when I was younger, I was raised Mormon, so I can only talk about being raised Mormon, but it wasn't unheard of to be like a Democrat and be Mormon. Like there were a few apostles who were Democrat. There was even, a senator who was a Democrat Mormon. It wasn't unheard of. But now you really do hear over the pulpit, not just Mormonism, but Christian churches in general, say that you can't be Democrat and Christian. Like I don't remember that rhetoric when I was younger. And white evangelical Protestants are now 90% Republican aligned. And the majority of that group, which is the more shocking figure, 66% of that 90% Republican group, really believe in Christian nationalism, that we should declare ourselves a Christian nation and that we stand under condemnation of God if we do not declare ourselves a Christian nation. Now, conversely, religious unaffiliated Americans are now 70% Democrat. And so these alignments show that politics is the primary organizing framework, not theology and not religious belief. It's not about theology anymore at all. It's about politics first. So Americans today, because of the divide and how we are, and it wasn't that way 30 years ago, we're just more likely to find a church that matches our politics than adopt our politics to our church. And so the Journal of Politics has some more studies showing that congregations have become really homogenous since the 1990s, really since Christianity got into bed with the political right for more power because they felt threatened. This is like the Jerry Falwell kind of American history. And that politicization of religion has led to the collapse of congregations where you can hold two different parties. And now there's a surge of religious disaffiliation among liberals because they don't see their political values in church. And now there's a rise in Christian nationalism, especially in conservative people who go to church. And churches are now becoming echo chambers instead of moral counterbalances, which they could be. It really used to be in America that churches could hold space for the political values of either side. There was order and structure and purity and loyalty, which are common core values for the political right. But then there was also service and charity and empathy and justice, which are common core values of the political left. And it was possible for one congregation to hold all of that in tension. It was always tension, and like no church I think did that perfectly. There was always tension, but you could at least hold it. Whereas now it seems like your options overall in America is to be liberal and spiritual but not religious, or attend something like UU, which is more or less operating like a political religion, or you're conservative, and that means you find a church that supports your conservative values, and all you see in Jesus is a strong leader, not the Jesus that mourns with those that mourn. And so psychologists call this the motivated religious cognition, which is when we interpret religion through the lens of our deeper identity needs. And now in America, political identity is kind of your core part of yourself. In fact, the Pew research found in 2020 that Americans are more uncomfortable with their child marrying someone from the opposite political party than someone from a different religion. And so it makes sense that we're building our religious identities around our political ones. Most people in America really would rather you marry someone in a religion that they either don't know about or understand, or even religions that like have in the past fought each other. They would rather have that than you marry someone from the other side of the political aisle. Which brings us to Republican Jesus versus Democrat Jesus, because at this point, it really feels like we're reading two entirely different gospels depending on the party. And it's really interesting to see how each side of the political aisle reads the Bible. So Republican Jesus is about law and order. He respects authority, prioritizes personal responsibility, emphasizes sexual purity, believes that prosperity is a sign of righteousness. We just saw this recently with Dave Ramsey. He got this question on one of the call-ins that was like, hey, what about that Christian thing that like, rich men are going to heaven? Isn't this kind of greedy? And then Dave Ramsey goes like, oh, I have 20, 30 properties. I don't even know anymore. I don't know the number, but because I'm Christian, I'm managing them for God. So it's not greed. And he got roasted online pretty heavily for that. And then also being deeply suspicious of outsiders. And so this Republican Jesus is kind of portrayed as a divine bodyguard for tradition American values: capitalism, gun rights, border enforcement, religious freedom, but somehow only for Christians. And this Jesus like might flip over tables, but it's only if like the drag queens are reading to the kids. Like it's not flipping tables of the institution in any way. Now, Democrat Jesus is a refugee. He's homeless, brown-skinned, radically inclusive. He centers the poor and the marginalized. He heals without asking for payment. He flips tables of the institution in protest of greed. He breaks purity laws in order to extend compassion. And this Jesus criticizes the empire, criticizes wealth, and says things like, blessed be the peacemakers, and the first shall be last. Now, obviously, these are both selective projections, but projections that have real power, because churches aren't just spiritual homes anymore. They're like political sorting machines. If you walk into a church today and hear a sermon about feeding the hungry and racial justice, you know within 5 seconds of hearing a sermon how that pastor votes. And if you hear a sermon about the dangers of secular culture and abortion and a need to take back America, you know how that pastor votes too. And so what used to be one Jesus holding both justice and righteousness in tension, now that Jesus has been split in two. Like it used to be that there was room for law under Jesus, but there was also room for compassion. And so you could kind of hold both. But now we've split that Jesus into two characters. And so churches are fracturing over this. Like we can't even talk anymore because we're not even following the same Jesus anymore. We're not reading the same things out of the Bible. No one is more different than Republican and Democrat Jesus. And yet they're coming from the same text, as each side kind of cherry picks their own verses to say only their Jesus is the real one. And when really, like, we don't know, we'll never know who Jesus really was, because he never bothered to write anything down, and no one that he knew wrote anything down either. So I don't even know why we think we know the real Jesus. And the tension between the two versions of Jesus this isn't just like a theological debate for, theologians in ivory towers. This isn't rhetoric anymore. Like entire denominations are splitting over political lines. So take the United Methodist Church. It's one of the largest Protestant denominations in the United States. And for years, they tried to hold together a global body with like conservative and progressive members. But the debate over same-sex marriage and LGBTQ clergy broke that tension. And in 2022, the more conservative congregations formed a new denomination called the Global Methodist Church, which explicitly opposed the inclusion of LGBTQ individuals in marriage and in ordination. And by 2024, I think it was almost 8,000 2,000 churches had disaffiliated from the UMC over this issue in the US alone. And so we're actually splitting denominations. And it looks like, for at least how things are going right now, if trends were to continue, it almost feels like there'll be a Republican and Democrat version of every single religion. Or like that religion will be this, and then UU will be this. And like every religion's going to pick a side. And if a church can't pick a side, they'll just split in half, is literally what's happening. And so the thing is that while this debate is framed in theological language, like what does the Bible say? What tradition demands? What this really is political polarization. The UMC didn't split because of a disagreement about scripture. It's not like anyone was poring over the theology over what Jesus has to say about gay marriage, because there's not much to say there. It's split because this congregation could no longer stay in community with people who voted differently. Like we're no longer able to maintain that anymore in America. And with something like Unitarian Universalism, you get the opposite. This is mostly operating as a Christian church for washed out liberal Christians. That's mostly what it is. Many people leave traditional religion and find UU not because they're searching for God, but because they're searching for a community where their progressive politics mixed in with their theology feels supported. So Pew data shows that UU is far more politically liberal than any other religious group, even more than Jewish Americans, which are statistically more liberal. And so the UU that I speak at in Boise from time to time, like before their meeting, they will acknowledge the land that they're on and who it originally belonged to. They're very active in social justice, environmentalism, anti-racism, LGBTQ rights, immigration justice. These aren't just like side issues in the UU church. They're central to the liturgy and the sermons and the identity. And so in many congregations, you'll hear more references to white supremacy culture or reproductive rights than to like traditional religious texts. And in many ways, it's operating more as a political religion than a theological religion, because it really doesn't require you to have specific theological beliefs at all. And so what ties it together is not theology, but politics. And so if you naturally have core values from the political right, and this can confuse some people, like that we do have core values that align with the political right. I'm not really talking about Trump per se. I'm talking about more generally, and that there are times that we need those political values. But if you want to attend UU, you may not always feel welcome, honestly. Personally, for me, even as someone whose core values more easily aligns with the left, the one-sided political aspects of UU are sometimes frustrating for me, because sometimes for me, this is just my experience, and maybe it's different here in Boise, but it sometimes feels like we've left a theological religion and gone into a political religion. And I don't want my identity to be boxed in either way. I want to be able to recognize that there are core values and different approaches that we need for different times. And there are times that I feel like UU isn't able to hold that because it's operating as a political religion. And UU is about 94% white. It's the highest average education level and the lowest belief in God rates of any denomination. And it's a spiritual community that, intentionally or not, is a sanctuary for people who are leaving like traditional religion and traditional faith and theology, but they're leaving it not for political reasons. They're leaving it because of the conservative politics around that kind of side of their faith. And so to me, there's some times where there's little difference between a UU sermon and a Democratic National Convention speech, and that can be concerning to me at times, because I don't want my identity, just like I don't want to have my identity be entirely wrapped around my beliefs, I also don't want my entire identity to be wrapped around my politics either. Now, shockingly, just last week, switching gears here, the IRS announced that churches can now officially endorse political candidates to their congregations without risking their tax-exempt status. This is brand new. This effectively guts the Johnson Amendment, which for decades has prevented churches from being used as campaign tools. And now, literally starting last week, pastors are free to explicitly tell congregates who to vote for and officially endorse candidates, further erasing the line between church and state, and that no one will lose their tax-exempt status over it. Now, does this change a lot actually? Probably not, because churches were already becoming political, and only one church has actually lost its tax exempt status. And it was a church in 1992 that took out ads against Bill Clinton, and they lost their tax exempt status. That was a long time ago. So it's not something that the IRS has been policing, honestly. But what it does do is signal to evangelical and conservative religious organizations that this is a landmark victory for religious freedom and free speech, and a fulfillment of promises, because Trump promised to weaken this amendment in his first term. And so this has been considered a win for God against secularism. And now you can officially hear congregations say, we are endorsing so-and-so for president, or we are endorsing so-and-so in this local race, and we need to support this guy against the godless whatever person on the other side. And so critics, including nonprofit watchdogs like the National Council of Nonprofits, warn that this is going to open the gates for political money laundering via churches, where contributions go to the church and the church isn't taxed, and then the church can endorse candidates. And this ruling could also redraw the boundaries of church and state separation, especially ahead of the 2026 midterms, because now megachurches could be called in to influence local elections or close races, even policy battles. And so at a time where religious identity is already more about your political identity, we're now effectively removing a key guardrail from keeping churches from becoming just overt campaign platforms. We no longer have that guardrail. And so we're not really doing religion in America anymore. No one is actually reading their Bible. The only person I think who is actually trying to decipher what the Bible says for itself is Dan McClellan. Everyone else, I think, is using it just to back up their politics. And no one is doing theology anymore. No one is really actually concerned with what does the Bible say in context. We're just using whatever, verses you want to pull out of the Bible to have these political fights and political debates. And so and another thing is, I don't even have time to go into how many people have gotten excommunicated over LGBTQ issues and political reasons across all of the religions in America. My own doctorate professor, Thomas Ord, who has probably, for me at least, the most beautiful concept of theology I've ever heard. Not enough for me to believe it, but the most beautiful one I've ever heard. He's the leader of open and relational theology currently. And he's honestly one of the most Christ-like people I've ever met. And I've watched him in Boise. He doesn't live very far from me. I watched him not only get fired from being a professor at NNU, which is a Nazarene college here, but I also watched him last year as he got excommunicated from the Nazarene church, even though he's a brilliant theologian. And it's not sex scandals or anything like that. Like, brilliant theologian, brilliant theology, and a beautiful person, like a kind, beautiful person, no scandals. And he's getting excommunicated because of political reasons. And that's not just the Nazarene church. That is across the board. Every single church, I feel like in America, I shouldn't say every, because I know that there's exceptions, but especially the Christian flavor churches, we're seeing excommunications really over political reasons rather than theological reasons. And so it was interesting to see religion in my lifetime, especially as I've been studying the religion the past 20 years. It's interesting to see religion become so political. And something that I saw in the Mormon world, I'm sorry, like, this isn't a Mormon podcast. It's just the religion that I use as a case study the most, because it's the one I'm the most familiar with. But once you understand religions, they're all operating in similar ways, to be honest. But I remember when President Nelson, the prophet of the Mormon church, and he became prophet, and everybody was super excited because he's a scientist, he's a surgeon, he's a man that we need for the end times. He's going to reconcile science and religion. And so everyone was super happy when he became the prophet. And then when he got on the pulpit and said, you should get vaccines because it helps the most compromised in our communities, the Mormon church congregation said no. And it was the first time that I could remember, at least, where the prophet was saying something and this whole religion is about following the prophet. And for political reasons, the church essentially said, like the church body said, my politics matters than my theology and following the prophet. Now, this isn't a discussion on vaccines themselves, like that's way outside the lane of my expertise. But it was interesting to watch that members, when they had to choose between following the prophet and politics, Mormons collectively and other churches followed suit. The members chose politics. And that's a really big deal in Mormonism. This is a religion built on prophetic authority and following the prophet, even when it doesn't make sense. And so the whole structure rests on obedience and deference to church leadership. So for members to publicly and collectively reject the prophet and say he's wrong over partisan politics was a huge shift. We'd never seen anything like that. It wasn't just disagreement, it was a signal that the real loyalty had moved elsewhere. They're much more loyal to politics than they are to their own prophet. The only other time that I remember the Mormon church, this is like such a niche side issue, but the only other time that I remember the Mormon church saying something where the church body said no is there was about 6 months where the church said you're not allowed to engage in oral sex. This is like for my parents' generation. And my parents' generation are such little sexual freaks, God bless them, that there was a huge backlash and the church eventually rescinded it. But that's not a political thing. That was just apparently people really liking oral sex. And so there have been times where like the church body has said no, but I can't remember a time where the church body essentially said, no, we're not following the prophet because my politics matters more. And so that was, the oral sex thing, that's about personal behavior, not political identity. What we're seeing now, especially kind of with the vaccine moment, is that people's politics is now the most sacred thing to them. It's what people defend with scripture. It's what they break with the prophet over. And that's not just Mormonism, that's everywhere. The deeper point is that in America today, when theology and politics clash, politics always wins. And so Gen Z is watching this, and they're mostly opting out, except for Gen Z men who are returning to church because it's the last place in America where you can be a conservative man with pride, where you can be valued for your conservative politics. And so Gen Z men are the only ones that are interested in church. Everyone else, Gen Z conservative men, I should say, are the only ones interested in church because that's the place where they can be affirmed for their conservative values. Everyone else in Gen Z seems to be looking at this and seeing the hypocrisy and seeing how religions are so political, that they're just opting out altogether. Now, before I close out, I do have to mention that Catholicism in America isn't split overwhelmingly one way or the other. They are currently the ones who are most holding political tensions. So white Catholics lean Republican, but only like 60-65%. Latino Catholics, and that's a fast growing demographic, lean Democrat, about 65-70%. And what this does is it makes Catholicism the largest politically divided religious group in America. They're so big and so old and so multicultural and so multinational, that they're essentially the only large religion that is holding both sides of the political aisle the most in America. And they haven't split really because Catholicism is so much bigger than America. If Catholicism was only in America, I feel like they would have split by now. But Catholicism in America is a small thing compared to Catholicism in other places. And so they're just forced to hold that tension. But it is falling apart in America. So on one side, you have MAGA Catholics, and these are devout traditionalists who see America in moral decline. They're embracing Christian nationalism. They're especially opposing the last Pope, Pope Francis, and his progressive views on climate change and immigration and capitalism. And then on the other side, you have the Pope Francis Catholics who see Catholicism as a force for social justice and compassion and inclusion even of queer Catholics. And this has come to blows a few times, like at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which has frequently clashed with Pope Francis, especially over his handling over political issues, abortion, LGBTQ issues, and his rebuke of traditionalist movements. And so some American bishops have accused Pope Francis of diluting the gospel and moving away from orthodoxy, and that even calls that there's something wrong with Pope Francis and he needs to be removed. And then the conservative bishops suggested that President Biden at the time, who's a practicing Catholic who supports abortion rights, should be denied communion because of his abortion stance. And the Vatican had to come in and step in and say, hey, Americans, you need to calm down. We're not going to deny communion over political issues. But if it was just, if Catholicism, if the power in Catholicism was in America, I think you would see a lot bigger issues. So far in America, even though they've had a lot of issues with conservative bishops trying to take away the sacrament from Biden, and then you have the MAGA Catholics that are calling out Pope Francis, and it gets really ugly. But so far, Catholics have been able to have congregations where there are people who vote differently, and they're able to do that because this isn't Italy. Like, this isn't Latin America. This is America, and Catholics are not a voting majority, and they're not a religious majority, and they're not really powerful. And so it isn't a great relationship. There's lots of tension from both sides, and we'll see how that plays out with Trump being Trump and how hard it is to see him as a Christian. And then also this new pope that we have, which we have to see how that goes too. And so we're just going to have to wait and see how Catholicism will continue to hold this really uneasy tension, but it is falling apart. We're starting to see progressive Catholics in America leaving the church, and we're starting to see hardline conservative Catholics grow louder and grow more political. And so Catholic Gen Zers are leaving in large numbers because they're citing hypocrisy and too much political nonsense and rigidity. And I think we should expect that trend to continue in the US with progressive Catholics leaving or getting increasingly frustrated, and then the Gen Zers leaving, and then the conservative ones really starting to get very loud and political, especially the MAGA kind of Catholics. And so what I personally dislike about all of this, because you know me, I'm no apologist for organized religion, but what I miss is that it used to be that in your local congregation, you would bump into people who were different than you. And there was honestly something magical about that. You had to sit next to someone who voted differently, who lived differently, who thought differently. And you were still told, this is your neighbor, love your neighbor. There's something genius, maybe even sacred about that in the structure of it. So take Mormonism, for example. Again, like, it's just the one that most easily comes to my mind. Say what you will about the doctrine, and there's plenty to say. The doctrine is wild, but the sociology of it is brilliant. You didn't shop for your favorite pastor. You didn't curate your ideal belief community. You were assigned a square, which is a ward, by geography, and you were given a job in that ward, and everyone has a job, and your job is to love and serve the people inside that square. And some of them you loved, and some of them were annoying, but that was your community. And over time, that created real community, because there was friction, but there was also humility. You had to learn how to love people who annoyed you. You had to learn how to love people who voted differently than you, and you had to show up anyway and see their humanity. And that's part of what created Mormonism to be some of the strongest tight-knit communities that we have in America. And that used to be what religion had to offer at its best. It wasn't just comfort, but it was inconvenience. It was a space where you might be challenged, maybe by a person, maybe by a parable, maybe by a different reading of Jesus. And that's not what we're doing anymore. Now church has become one more space that reinforces our political identity. That's all that it seems to be doing. It's just echoing what we already believe, and we're told that our values are God's values, and our enemies are God's enemies too. No one's being spiritually stretched. No one's like really loving their neighbor that's different. Nobody's being asked to break open and see someone's humanity. Now we're just echo chambers. And that's all it is. And that matters, because for all its flaws, religion was one of the last places in American life where radically different people were still trying to do something together, where rich and poor and old and young and red and blue could be in the same room, hearing the same song, hearing the same parable, and then showing up for some service project. That used to be what religion could do. And there was something beautiful about that I have to admit to, even as an atheist. And I, even as a secular person, would rather have religions that did that than religions that are so entrenched that they become echo chambers, that God is on their side and their enemies are on the other side. And so even though like I'm not attending church, like I'm not cheering over this. This doesn't make me happy, because the one thing that religion used to do really well, better than secularism, honestly, was gather unlike people with a bigger myth that could contain them. It was a container big enough for difference. And we lost that. And now everything is just politics. And all someone has to say is, I support public libraries. And you can guess everything about them. You know who they voted for. You know what their political stances are. You can guess their religion. And all they said is, I support public libraries, because, but now everything means something political. And so what my hope is that as the pendulum swings towards religious power, religious freedoms, we're losing the line between church and state. Religions are becoming enmeshed with politics. The pendulum is going that way. And what I hope is that that reaches its extreme and starts swinging the other way, and that we start kind of collectively rejecting this madness. Like something that I hope happens in my lifetime, and that I think is a reasonable goal because other countries have done this, is to require that churches provide community service for those tax exemptions. That's what the tax exemption was for. So you could feed the poor and house the homeless and take in orphans and marry people and provide rituals and provide moral education. That was the trade-off that we've made. And that's not like an FU tax the churches as like a revenge. I feel like that attitude doesn't get you very far. But really, as an attitude, like, you got tax exemptions because we were supposed to make a deal. The deal was that you provide service to our communities. You're no longer doing that. You're just political. That's all that you're doing. All you're doing is supporting people's political identities. So why are you getting tax write-offs? And if they're just political centers now that can fully endorse candidates, why are you getting tax exemptions? You're playing in political games now, like everybody else, like corporations and individuals. So you should be taxed. And so let's make churches earn their tax exempt status again by doing the work that they were trusted with: feeding people, sheltering people, building bridges. I want to see churches that actually serve their cities, where if they closed tomorrow, the neighborhood would notice, because the food pantry would be gone and the tutoring program would stop and the child support would stop and the elder care would disappear, not because the political campaign machine lost a donor list. And so what I hope, and what I also hope, is that we'll see a new generation of religious leaders, especially among Gen Z, who are hopefully watching this madness and who may have an opportunity to refuse to be puppets of either party, who will refuse to preach party platforms dressed up in parables. And I'm thinking of young clergy who say, like, my faith isn't my mascot. It's not a megaphone for the right or the left. It's a radical invitation to show up in the world differently and to do it together. Like, religion is always going to exist. Like, I could talk about, oh, I wish that this would bring down religion and we just all live in this secular unicorn place. But religion is always going to exist. It's just too perfectly wired for our brains. So if religion is going to exist, I hope Gen Z can find ways to do religion where they aren't just political puppets. I hope that they can figure that out. And I hope as a society we realize that that churches are getting tax exempt status and they're not providing us anything in return. They used to, perhaps, but they don't anymore. Even take something like Mormonism, for how rich it is. When they say we do community service, they're including the hours that their missionaries spend, which is like, that's their goal anyway. And they have their shell companies and all of that, but are they actually helping the broader community? The answer is no. Like, they really aren't. Are they baptizing dead people and spending a lot of time doing that, so that dead people can become Mormon and have their proper rituals? Yeah, they're doing that. Can we really call that community service? I think no. And so what I would love to see, like, in my lifetime, is not only Gen Z reject this and have the pendulum come the other way, but I hope we reestablish what this deal was supposed to be with churches. You're supposed to provide service. You're supposed to provide a social safety net. You're supposed to provide rituals. You're supposed to provide morality and a moral education. And if you're not doing that, why are you getting tax exemptions? So that's what I would hope to see from this train wreck, and I'll be watching this for a long time. And right now, that pendulum, especially with Trump, is still swinging towards religious power. But I hope that in my lifetime, I will start to see the pendulum come back the other way. And what I hope is that things essentially are bad enough that we will collectively start to reject that this is what religion now is in America. Because even as a secular person, even as an atheist, like, religion can be better than this. And I want it to be better than this, because this is not helping anyone. Now religion in America is essentially the place that you go where God tells you that your political party is the right one. Like, and that is like the lowest form of what is possible with religion. There are beautiful things that religions can do too. I will admit that. But we're not doing that anymore. We're just playing politics. So let me know what you think of this episode. Leave some ideas in the comments for me for future episodes. Let me know what you want to hear. I think next week I'm going to do how nihilism shows up in relationships and what that data looks like, unless you have a better idea for me. And then let me know like what nuances you felt like I left out of this episode. There's so many different churches and churches that I didn't mention, and data that I didn't mention too, just because I'm already at like over a half hour. So let me know what I'm missing that deserves to be added to this conversation. But just overall, it's been interesting in my lifetime since starting to study religion, how now your politics matters much more than your religion, and nobody's doing theology anymore. So let me know what you think, and I'll see you next week. Bye.